It's working. It's wonderful to be here today. Dina, Sherif, and I will be co-moderating this session, and we want to briefly introduce the speakers. So to my right, we have Amena El-Saie, who is the co-founder and CEO of Hilm, Egypt. We have Tom Speechley, who is the partner and head of global markets for the Abraj Group. We have Shehab El-Nawawi, who is CEO of Giza Systems. Dina, do you want to get started?
Yeah, I do. Thank you all for being with us here today. Again, I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Ahead of the Curve. I just wanted to say very quickly that I have a plane to catch, so I may have to leave a little bit early, so please forgive me. I'm going to start out with Tom. I think oftentimes the Middle East is perceived as a region that is highly unstable, and Egypt in particular, for example, has been struggling to get foreign direct investment. And Abraj has been in the Middle East for over, 15 years now, and you continue to invest in the region. Do you think that there is opportunity? What is the investment climate in the Middle East from your perspective? And why are we not seeing more people flowing there, although there is a lot of opportunity?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for the introduction. And just stepping back a little bit, because it's going to inform the answer. Abraj has been around for 15 years, and we did indeed start in the Middle East. I spent 7 years there working with a firm on investments across the Middle East. But we've diversified a lot, and today the Middle East is less than 20% of what we do. And we're also investing in Latin America and Africa, Turkey, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And the reason I tell you that is because, in a sense, I want to say that I don't have a particular bias towards the Middle East. I do like that part of the world. I spent a long time there. My children were born there, but it's not the only horse in the race for us. But what I want to say is that, perhaps surprisingly, over the last 3 to 5 years, I would say the Middle East and North Africa has been the most attractive investment destination in emerging markets. And I'm sure that comes as a shock to many people. But just to give you some numbers around that, I mean, we've made, not dozens, but probably 15 investments there in the last 5 years. They've been the most the best performing investments we've made, more or less. And, IRRs that people in the US could only dream of. I mean, annualized returns in the 80% plus. And it speaks to two things. One is just basically a lack of understanding of the region, and particularly the mispricing of risk. So if you get your investment advice from CNN or the US State Department, you're unlikely to be investing there, right? It looks like it's a fairly risky place, just from what you see on the news. But when you're an investor, you can afford to take a very different view. And that is to look through the headlines, look past the headlines, and look at the economic realities on the ground. And so just to pick up on Tunisia, which was the subject of the last panel, after the Arab Spring, and we were investing in Tunisia before, during, after. After the Arab Spring, the markets basically started telling you that, obviously it was a high-risk place to invest. And, would-be investors in North Africa would say, yes, look, see, that's exactly why I don't invest there. Look at the risk. But they didn't stop to think as to whether the economy was still growing or whether the consumer was still there. In fact, what happened after the Arab Spring was the market said it's too risky. If you looked at the sovereign credit default swap rating of the country, it went through the roof. The market saying, don't invest there, it's too risky. The stock market started selling off a bit. The Tunisian dinar was sold, oversold. But GDP continued to grow. And in fact, the consumer, which is the part of GDP we're interested in, continued to increase because the type of consumption that happens in Tunisia, which is early stage discretionary and consumer staples, was still very solidly there. And so if you can see through that and you can invest against it, you're going to do well. And the types of companies we invested in were pharmaceutical production companies. One we invested in before the Arab Spring, one 6 days after. We just said we're still doing it because we thought it was a defensive sector. People are going to still need pharmaceuticals, no matter who's in power. We invested in a confectionery business that sold single package muffins, and it was by far the market leader. The first pharmaceutical business was bought by a big international consolidator, an Italian public company. The second one we IPO'd about 6 months ago, and the confectionery business we sold to a big German company, all at extraordinarily high IRRs. Why? Because people had mispriced the risk. We saw the opportunity, we looked at those businesses, we said they're solid, and they're going to perform in what appears to be a politically turbulent environment. So, you know, and I could go on to Egypt actually as well. Egypt is a country of 100 million people with basic consumer needs, consumer staples. If you're selling diapers in Cairo, you're probably doing well. If you're selling basic food commodities in Cairo, you're probably doing well. If you're into hospitals in Cairo, if you're into education, private sector education in Cairo, you're probably doing well. And again, we invested in all those sectors. On the hospital side, you know, we went, because no one else was investing, we went and bought single asset hospitals at 7 times EBITDA, which for those of you who know the healthcare space is just a steal. We put 3 of them together, called it a group, and it was immediately worth 13 times EBITDA. So again, investment now it needs to be divorced completely from headline hysteria, concerns about politics. Yes, there's risk there, but it's mispriced, fundamentally mispriced.
I wanted to follow up on that as well. Thank you for that important sort of context in terms of the investment climate. But Dina, I actually wanted to throw this back at you because I think it's a nice transition. Many of the sessions at the conference, at the summit, and the overall theme in terms of public-private partnerships have revolved around impact investing and development and how we can actually leverage the private sector to push the development agenda forward, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals or National Development Plans. And you've been a real champion in the region as CEO of Ahead of the Curve, really voicing and working on impact investing. Can you tell us a little bit about this transition away from traditional investment in business, in traditional businesses toward investments in impact enterprises?
Yeah, I think after 2011, when we saw the Arab Spring, what we saw is there is a rising trend in young entrepreneurs who are starting economically viable businesses that were really working to solve a major problem in society. Or if I were to translate that in 2016, young entrepreneurs who are creating businesses to really work on sustainable development goals like healthcare, education, environment, energy. However, we didn't really see an increase in investors, either VC funds or angel investors, who are interested in investing in those businesses. So I think what we're seeing now is a little bit more awareness amongst investors within the Arab region about the importance of investing in these types of businesses. And Ahead of the Curve was very early on in the game through a lot of research we were doing on the ground, realizing that there was potential to get, as Tom said, a high ROI, financial ROI, but also a very high return in terms of social returns as well. And I think there's definitely something to be seen in the Middle East when it comes to early stage impact enterprises and how they're going to grow and scale in the future.
It's fantastic. And I think a nice piggyback on that is actually getting the perspective in entrepreneurs. So as head of Rise Egypt, the organization that I lead, we run a fellowship program, a 2-year fellowship program, and we support growth stage social enterprises in the region. Amena El-Saie is CEO of Hilm, which actually is such a nice piggyback to the presentation we just saw by Victor, because they work on disabilities and accessibility and employment issues in the region. So I'd love to get your perspective, Amena, on the work that you're doing. If you could share a bit about the work that you're doing, and also, you know, so often we're talking about, in terms of development, you know, the youth bulge in the region and the unemployment rates in the region and all these sorts of things. Well, and the importance of, you know, people-driven solutions, and that essentially is you. You represent that. You are, you know, a young entrepreneur who's taking the bull by its horns and doing this work in the region. Can you speak a little bit about what you're doing and the impact that it's making, and also, you know, what the challenges and opportunities are ahead?
Okay, so I'm actually 26 years old, and Ramz and I started the organization about 2 years ago. We have started by helping persons with disabilities to access their career opportunities and actually have access to their dreams. Actually, a lot of people did not realize that 15% of the Egyptian population are persons with disabilities. So if we're talking about opportunity, that's a huge opportunity. And a lot of these people are youth. So with Hilm, it's an organization or a social enterprise that is half persons operated by people who are people with disabilities and without disabilities. And we're also working on helping companies to actually fulfill their quota of the 5% of persons with disabilities. But the problem is, people get around this quota, and what they do is they actually hire people on paper, which means they are not working, but they're just taking a salary at the end of every month, which actually contributes even a bigger, it actually generates a bigger problem to the government and even to the persons with disabilities themselves, because they perceive themselves as people who are incompetent in Egypt and they do not understand their full potential. So we help them realize that. And on the other hand, we work with accessibility. So if we're talking about the full inclusion about persons with disabilities, we need to start by making every sector accessible. Every building that is built in Egypt should not be built in a way that is not accessible. And these are the two main points that we're focusing on. So in terms of the main issues that we faced, being young entrepreneurs who probably never started a business before, and we really want to do this, we really want to help these people, and then after studying and creating a proper needs assessment, we realized that, wait, that's a huge untacked workforce that could actually contribute to the economic growth of the whole country. How come the government does not realize how much this can help them? So this is what we started doing. We started working on strategizing and working on helping the society as a whole, whether the private sector or the public sector, realize how much they could benefit from such an opportunity.
That's fantastic. Thanks for giving that perspective.
So I think I'll ask you a follow-up, Mona. You've spent the past 3 years since you established RISE working with social entrepreneurs specifically in Egypt. What do you see as your next step as RISE, and where do you see yourself going from now? Your first group of fellows are actually graduating. You have one here, you have another one here in the audience. Educate me, Yasmin. How do you see this sector evolving in Egypt and actually growing?
So RISE Egypt essentially accelerates entrepreneurship for development in Egypt by investing in the capacity building of growth state social enterprises and also doing research. The next link, I think the next way forward for us is in using this evidence base of the research that we're doing with the entrepreneurs and sort of just at the macro level to drive policy change in the country. And I think that that's where the public-private partnerships are going to be so critical. Getting the private sector involved in moving away from just having a CSR department that does traditional charity, where we actually leverage the talent of companies to get involved, leveraging philanthropy to move away from traditional charity, and also think about strategic impact and how they can help bridge the inequities that we see in society and achieve some of the national development goals while also seeing the ROIs that we've been talking about all along. So I think in the next phase, what we're really going to be focusing on are building these public-private partnerships in Egypt, and specifically with the sectors in which we've gained a knowledge base and have been our core, so in education and the environment and inclusive employment from this first phase. And what I anticipate is in the fellowships to come, as we take on more and more understanding of various sectors, that we'll be able to catalyze some of those partnerships and scale up for the ecosystem. But that drives me to think about another part of the ecosystem, which is the private sector. So Shehab, you lead one of the major technology firms in the region, and you've been so engaged as well in civil society groups, in entrepreneurship, on the boards of Injez, for example, working very closely with the foundation that the company has. Can you talk a little bit about your role as a leader in the private sector in driving this change?
Yeah, thank you, Mona. And let me start by saying thank you for inviting me to join this distinguished panel. We feel that it is up to the private sector actually to take a lead role in developing the economy, and in specifically in developing or providing a base for entrepreneurs to be able to grow and develop. In this part of the world, we look at entrepreneur as the end product actually, but they are the end product of an ecosystem that helps them grow and develop. In our part of the world, things are not so streamlined, not so simple. I'm sure you know that. So in our work, we do a lot of work with incubators, with startup incubators, and we realize that we're a country of 100 million people, like Tom was saying, and it's important to understand that the little that we see, the percentage, the entrepreneurs that we see that are generated every year, and the successful ones that move on to actually commercialization of their products is a very, very, very minute percentage of the young people. And so we decided that we have to work at the, not at the early stage, but way before that. So education drives innovation, innovation drives entrepreneurship. So we started an initiative by building Fab Labs, which are, Fab Labs are, for those in the audience that don't know, Fab Labs are an initiative of the MIT Center of Bits and Atoms 7 or 8 years ago. And the concept was to democratize technology, so make technology, high-end technology, available to communities for free or for a very, very small fee. So what we are doing, we are establishing Fab Labs all over, not just Cairo, but in the rest of Egypt as well. We're starting out actually around November the 11th. We roll out our first mobile Fab Lab. So we put all the equipment that is traditionally available in a lab, and we stuff them on a bus. Not a very big bus, but we stuff them on a bus along with the instructors, and they're rolling out to the governorates around the 11th of November. So the concept is that it moves to a governorate and plants a seed of a Fab Lab there. So we do courses, we install the technology, we set up actually a Fab Lab in that governorate. We stay per governorate 2 months, then move on to the next one and leave our legacy of a Fab Lab with under the management of locally developed talent, so from that governorate. And the concept is that we build a network of technologists that would then hopefully filter into a subset of entrepreneurs spread throughout the country. And we feel that it's you know, the government can't do everything, and it's the private sector's role to take this initiative and move forward with it. So that's one of the initiatives that we're doing in terms of trying to spread technology and help that in the development of our young people, of which we have plenty. I mean, it just goes against the youth bulge. You know, everybody's talking about the youth bulge and posing it as a problem. We see that this is an opportunity that cannot be missed.
I'm just going to butt in and add a follow-up. I think when we talk about this idea of entrepreneurship and development, it's particularly significant to the Middle East because of that youth bulge. So when you have a population, 65% of our population is under 34, and we have the highest youth unemployment rate in the world. So when we talk about entrepreneurship, it's not just about innovation and change and disrupting highly dysfunctional sectors in the region. It's also about creating very valuable jobs. But I just wanted to highlight that for our region, the private sector has actually been pivotal, I think, in drawing attention to the importance of entrepreneurship. And the Abraj Group, for example, is one of the first, I would say, companies that really put their money where their mouth is when it comes to supporting startups and the startup scene. And in 2010, they did the celebration of entrepreneurship. You have companies like MBC, and Mariam Farag is there, who are doing a lot to support social innovation and entrepreneurship. So I think that's one of really the positive narratives in the region. We have a long way to go in terms of shifting that thinking from charity to becoming more partners. However, there have been pioneers that I think without those pioneers, we really wouldn't be where we are today in the region. And with that, I would love to ask Tom a follow-up of, I think Abraj has, since 2009, really had a heavy focus on entrepreneurship for very clear reasons. I think Arif Naqvi is always very clear about how he believes in the importance of investing in youth and young people, but also in investing in these early stage businesses because we need a pipeline. So a private equity firm like Abraj, if they don't invest in getting new businesses, you yourself could be out of business. So where is Abraj today? And you know, specifically in that area, globally and in growth markets at large?
Yeah, so we're still huge believers in the power of entrepreneurship to shape economic success, but also to deliver hope. I mean, one of the things that was really sort of lacking, and it was arguably sort of the start of the root cause of the Arab Spring, was a lack of hope, not for political disenfranchisement, as people often said, but actually economic disenfranchisement. They thought there was no prospect for employment and so on, and so, you know, they went out on the streets. So the fact is, I think that the entrepreneurship in the Middle East is as strong as any part of the world I've ever been to, right? Honestly, you know, including without limitation the United States. It's just an amazing scene going on there, and people who haven't seen it can go and visit. There's so much going on in that space, and it does bring hope, actually. I think there's a couple of structural challenges that we have to sort of acknowledge. One is that early stage companies, first of all, don't necessarily scale, and they don't necessarily create employment. So to some extent, they create false hope for, you know, the populace. It's still the case that the big employers in that part of the world, in fact everywhere, are old-style businesses. Unfortunately, old-style businesses, brick-and-mortar businesses in the Middle East are often owned by dynastic families and the like. And so there's very little hope or opportunity to break into a sector to some extent, and that's why people are focused on tech or tech-enabled businesses. And the second, I think, challenge is just the ability to get the capital, to pick the winners, to scale through and become large companies. I mean, there are examples of successful tech companies in the Middle East. Giza, obviously, in Egypt, one of the most important, actually, an employer of a lot of people. Jordan, Egypt, home to some amazing startups that have scaled, the souk.coms of the world and so on, and there's a group coming through. But I think we just have to be a little bit realistic that starting a company is different from scaling a company. And even if you're scaling a tech company, is it really going to provide mass employment and solve that issue of youth unemployment?
Well, and I think you bring up an important sort of cultural shift that's happening, Tom, in terms of the optimism and hope of entrepreneurship. And I also think it addresses a misunderstanding that there's always needs to be some sort of outside-in intervention in the region. And we often talk about the security and political situations, whereas, you know, that's something that will continue, you know, to, you know, have its ups and downs. But I think what has been consistent and has been really an amazing story in the region is, especially post-Arab Spring, sort of this emergence of entrepreneurship and the entire culture shift that comes with it, of collaboration, cooperation, of, you know, understanding the importance of team, of supporting each other, and also of taking the lead in the change in the region. And again, Amena, you know, the work you're doing is so inspiring because it represents all of those things. And I want to ask you a bit about, you know, being in that space. You know, what does this mean for the next generation? And what are the things that you need to help scale? You know, what are the things you need as an organization, not in terms of the detail, but in terms of, you know, as your relationship to the private sector, you know, from the government, the regulatory environment, the cultural shifts, perceptions. What are the things that you feel could really help an organization like Helm, which is both creating jobs inside of your organization, but also for others outside of the organization? How do we do that?
I think one of the key challenges that we face is the way people perceive us in Egypt as a social entrepreneur. You know, they confuse being a nonprofit or doing something that is charitable with actually doing something that is good while being profitable. So people don't want to invest in social enterprises, not because they really don't understand the concept or they get confused. So I think there's a big component here of raising awareness within the culture of what does a social enterprise mean. And this, we're trying to focus on this part as Helm, even within disability, which is like double the effort because you're trying to remove cultural stigmas within, you know, people with disabilities and how they're perceived as, you know, one example I was mentioning yesterday is one of our 400 volunteers, the first time they came to Helm, they said, oh my God, this is the first time I ever see a person with a disability that is not a beggar. And that describes the big problem that we're facing. Aside from that, being one of many young entrepreneurs, we are also facing the challenge of finding the right resources, the right guidance. Due to the lack of awareness of social enterprises, you find less people who are willing to help regarding how to grow a social enterprise, how to have social impact, and convince people to invest in you without looking at you from the eyes of, oh, they're using a good cause to gain money. On the other hand, we want to promote the idea for investors in the region and outside the region to think of us as not just a local benefit to the Egyptian society, but on a global level. We want to help social entrepreneurs in Egypt and in the region to understand that they can actually think and dream big and actually extend their mission on a global level. So for example, when we're talking about disability, if we're talking about solutions like the one that Victor just said, gave us an example of the wheelchair that he has created, this could actually help not just people in his country, but also it's a solution to people in Egypt and also in the US and everywhere. So that's the same kind of perception that we're trying to promote internally, to try to make people with disabilities and without disabilities understand that they can also invent something or go into the market and be there and actually be there on a global level. And I would like to give Rise Egypt as an example because I'm a Rise Fellow. And since Helm started, actually before Helm started, Rise Egypt was in our lives in a way because they started helping us to reach out to the global community. And that had a great impact on the way that Helm has grown from 1 employee to 25 in less than 2 years after the revolution, with all the problems of the political issues in Egypt, the struggles to find finances and everything. They have helped us to find strategically what we need to exactly do and how to use our resources. Also, another thing is how to gain access to amazing consultants like Eileen Seitzer, who's been to 68 countries and has been helping policy change regarding disability. That's something that could, make us run through all the things that we need to achieve in order to actually make a big impact. So this makes us being young in Egypt. Actually, people look at you as if it's age matters, okay? So basically, they start, okay, so Eileen's with them.
Doesn't matter.
Well, we're trying to do that, and it's working, by the way, because now when we're going to a meeting, 2 years ago when we were going, it's like, oh, these little cute kids, and they want to do something good, and they want to change Egypt, but it's so difficult. But now people are starting to understand that, no, it is possible. These people have 400 volunteers. They're making a project with 210 of the global companies in Egypt. We're talking companies like Vodafone who are investing in an organization that has just started. After 2 months, they said, oh, these people can actually do something. So it makes other companies like PepsiCo and many others start to think, okay, we can do the same. And they're not giving us money as philanthropy per se, but they need the service. So they actually ask us to do the work, and it's a service that they need. So this is the kind of approach that we're trying to take.
Thank you so much, Amena. And we want to open up for questions, actually.
I just have one question to ask you, Mona, though, before you open it up to the audience.
Sure.
Sorry, final question.
Sure.
Because I think since we're here, and this is Concordia, and we're in New York,
Sure.
I think it's really important for us to talk about what role the U.S. should be playing in this whole entrepreneurship for development in the Middle East, because here in the US, we always hear people talking about entrepreneurship, the Arab region, job creation. So I would love for you to actually talk about the role the US can play, but more specifically, the role that Arab Americans can be playing to support young entrepreneurs like Amena and also Yasmin and others.
Okay, thank you for that question. There is a lot of work happening. The President's Initiative, as was mentioned in the previous session, did have a large focus on entrepreneurship, and the Global Entrepreneurship Summits have convened many actors from the region year on year over the past, 6 years, 8 years. So in that sense, at that level, there has been a lot of work happening. I think the key question is in making the intimate linkages to actually see through, the success stories that we need to see. And also there is a huge potential to unlock in the diaspora. So Rise Egypt is actually organizing the Egyptian diaspora by simply creating technological solutions to gain, to have people join the global community, understanding their backgrounds, their professional backgrounds, and being able to make these linkages and creating the framework to engage them with strategic opportunities in Egypt, where they can essentially give back their intellectual and social capital to the country. So the idea is that, whether you directly mentor or work with the entrepreneurs or help them gain access to markets or institutions that you're part of, I think there's a lot of work that can happen there. And so I definitely think not just with the Egyptian diaspora, but with all the diasporas in the region, there's a huge potential there. And we've seen it work in other diasporas. So I agree that there's, it's work to be done, and I think we can, we've taken those first steps, and we should continue to collaborate for that. You have to run to the airport, or are you going to stay with us? Thank you, Dina, so much. Thank you for the work you're doing with Ahead of the Curve as well. So I want to open it up for questions. Yes?
Hi, great conversation. Two questions. One, for millennial entrepreneurs, what are the trends over in the Middle East in terms of businesses that are creating? Is it lifestyle? Is it entertainment? Is it media? Is it social entrepreneurship? And then the second part of that is, how are the millennials funding that? Is it crowdfunding? Is it friends and family? Is it venture capitalists? Is it angel investors? Is it institutional investing? And so that's what I'd be curious about.
I knew that would keep you here. Go for it, Dina.
Maybe I should answer that question before I leave. So I think the sectors where we see, obviously tech is on the rise in the Middle East, so we do see a lot of interesting startups in terms of mobile applications. But I think in terms of social entrepreneurship, the sectors of focus have been healthcare, education, and energy, renewable energy in particular. And in Egypt, we've also seen a very interesting rise in social enterprises working on the environment. Things like solid waste collection and of that sort. In terms of capital, like I said earlier, we don't have a lot of VC funds or angel investors who focus on impact entrepreneurs. They struggle a bit because it takes a little bit more time to get your financial returns, although it may be high. And if you define yourself as a social entrepreneur, they immediately shy away. So I invested in 5 years, invested in one of the fastest growing healthcare businesses in Egypt right now. It's micro health insurance, and they really struggled to raise capital 5 years ago. Now, everyone is jumping to invest in them because the concept has been proven and they're doing really well. But crowdfinancing, however, is on the rise. We have a crowdfinancing platform called Zumel out of Lebanon that is a platform for social enterprises to raise funds from the crowd. I think a major problem holding us back in that space is the regulatory environment. And crowdfunding is just not something that can actually happen legally yet. And that's something that we're still working on.
Yeah, and I think maybe Tom, you can mention also WEMDA and the work that's happening with WEMDA. To also answer the question about where the gaps are, you find some money at the seed level, and then you find the much larger sums. And I think it's that sort of missing middle that everybody talks about that's a real issue. So even getting it from $50,000 to $100,000 to $250,000 investment, Ahead of the Curve is doing that. There aren't a lot of funds doing that. I saw a list recently of all the funds in the region, and out of I don't know how many that were featured, 12 or something. It was definitely missing ones, but the main takeaway from it is that about 80 to 90% of them were focused on tech. So I think that's another major issue, is finding investment for some of these other areas that we're talking about.
Focused on tech, and they're fairly large tickets for our market. So a lot of, like the WAMDA fund, they'll look for at least $1 million as a minimum right now.
Right.
So it's a bit tough, I think.
Yeah. Yes? Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks, Mona, and all the panelists for the amazing work you've been doing. My name is Rabin Pasha, and I just got back from Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, where we launched the first entrepreneurship incubator there for young people and the displaced populations. And I say this, and a lot of people get amazed by that because they always think of Iraq and these places as an orphan child in terms of doing entrepreneurship. But I think at some point, and what I want to talk about and get your insights on, is we have to invest in those people and the organizations that are building the ecosystem there, because there's been a lot of great ideas and a lot of hope that can come out of not just the entrepreneurship in terms of creating the businesses and the jobs and growth of the economy, but also in changing that cycle of despair and disenfranchisement and the migration and the violent extremism that we're talking about. And one of our biggest challenges has been that when you go to places like well, I can't talk about Syria, but at least in Iraq or the Kurdistan region, and people in development community or private sector would tell us, well, go and get the support from government. They support entrepreneurship and youth. In reality, it's much harder than that, and it begs the question of how we can get support from this community here, and not the diaspora, but rather American companies, other entrepreneurs in the region, those who can be the angel investors to say, look, the ecosystem there is very difficult. But if we invest and help get something started, there's these young entrepreneurs, like the 165 that came to us in our program and the 16 that we picked and put them through our 2-week training, that have great solutions to all these huge problems that plague their society, and that could actually go to scale, that could create a circulation of cash in the economy, and that actually can create jobs, because we're not talking major tech things. We're talking like basic supply chain breakdowns that could be solved immediately by just one idea and a little bit of seed cash. So I'd love to get your perspective on how we can push the conversation and the support for places like that. Thank you.
I'll just make a couple of quick comments. I think access to capital for parts of the world are much more tight than in other parts, and Iraq, obviously, for reasons that are well documented, is a place where there's just not enough capital going into early stage businesses. And sometimes, a government-sponsored fund is the only capital that's going to be available, and I think you just got to take it if that's the case. Kurdistan, anecdotally, of course, is investable, I think, and purely from a security perspective. And to your point, traditional industry that's got supply chain issues or distribution issues, because of that, there's a great opportunity in logistics in that part of the world, or in power and all of the other infrastructure that needs to be built out there. So you should stick at that, I think. Your time will come. The rest of the Middle East is likewise. There are similar challenges everywhere, actually. I just don't think that the thing that's missing is not the entrepreneurial energy and class. It's not the opportunity, it's the scaling up potential of these businesses. And I think, to your point, Mona, it's about the fact that there's early stage capital, seed capital, angel, even the WAMDA stuff, and then there's the large capital that we don't typically write a check for less than $50 million, and there's not much in between. And that's the bit that really needs to be coalesced and brought into bear, because it's a great space to be in, by the way, because you've got these companies that have proven their model, but a large part of their growth is still ahead of them. So I think that's the challenge and the opportunity.
Thank you so much for that. So I think we're out of time, and we have to close the session for the next group. But thank you so much, and I hope it sheds some light on what's happening in the region.